Hi, my name is Ariana, and I'm the health coach for Integrative Family Medicine of Asheville. And today I'm joined by Hannah as we dive into an interview that focuses on grief and how we can cope skillfully with grief right now. And Tamara has a fantastic background of expertise to bring to this conversation. She has a master's in clinical psychology. She is a certified grief recovery specialist, certified through the Grief Recovery Institute. And her passion is to help people navigate their way through grief, loss, change, and big life transitions. She does this by creating a safe space where authenticity is welcomed, meaning laughter, crying, all the whole gamut of emotions, and where the goal is to process pain and grief so that they don't stick with us into our future. And so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and sharing what you know about grief.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So just to dive right in,
I think it's such a good question to start with. Like any good medicine, we've got to understand what's going on if we're going to help it very effectively, right? So for me, grief, we've kind of only used that word before about death and bereavement. If you probably would have asked anybody, I would say 2 years ago, that's what they would have thought grief was about. But for me, when I first came into grief recovery 10 years ago, it was like a light bulb went off in that it was the first time, even in my clinical experience, that I heard grief applied like to a broader lens of being able to see how grief really shows up in our lives in so many ways that then don't get named even. And so, in witnessing what's happened for people in this last year, even right there at the beginning, the first couple of months, people were missing, graduations were getting canceled, and people noticing like they were having really strong feelings about that. And I would hear people say things like, well, it's just a graduation. It's so, why do I feel this way or that way? But that is grief. And so one of my favorite, I say it's my favorite because it feels so effective, like definitions of grief, says that grief is whenever we experience conflicting feelings, when there's the end or change in something that was familiar. Okay. So we think about that, anything that's familiar, our daily routines, that changed. And, and maybe we had conflicting feelings about it. Maybe at some point we felt like, oh, that's kind of nice. I'm not going to have to wear my dress clothes to work and I can, work from home. And then we start to have other feelings about that. So, and bereavement's like that too. People can have these conflicting feelings. If you've ever had the loss of someone who'd been suffering for a long time, you can feel of course, the sadness and the sorrow, the feeling we expect to feel, but we could also, people sometimes feel relief that they're no longer suffering. And then with relief, they can feel guilty, so all of a sudden we start to get a tangle of all these feelings. Yeah. So I think what COVID has done is it's really broadened that lens of seeing and noticing that grief shows up in a lot of ways. Like, and I think it highlights then right there hand in hand that as a culture, we don't know how to do grief well. So here we're seeing and noticing grief a lot more, but we're feeling how we're not very well equipped to know what to do with it, especially in these less tangible types of grief, that are like, we don't have a funeral ritual for, missing celebrations or for grief that is ongoing. I would even say, I know it's bigger than the time we have today, but what we saw happening hand in hand with like, people feeling more connected to the grief of others. So seeing things in our society about the disparity or inequity that's there, whether it's with COVID and healthcare or with, racial inequity and things like that. It's like part of what COVID did, what this pandemic did, was it slowed us down. And I would say, when we slow down, that's when we like can feel more of what's already there. But that's, as a culture, we kind of keep ourselves so busy that we don't have to feel things too long. So I think what's important to think about in the experience of this last year is two things. That it really slowed us down. So we don't have a lot of the other ways we would have coped, even if those were just distractions. We couldn't go to the gym. We couldn't go, hang out with friends or do some of those things we would have normally do to kind of tune out the stress of the news that day. And so it's kind of stripped back, and helped and caused us to have to see and hear some things that are hard. And not all of that's bad, but it sure is overwhelming. And it adds to like, what do? We just absorb more and more feeling, not of our own loss, but the loss of others, right? And I
Yeah.
would say then the other thing is that it is that collective experience. So normally, like when someone goes through something hard, like a death, one person in your friendship group is going through that, right? It's not usually everybody going through it at the same time. So that's added a more difficult way. Like we don't know how to be there for each other. And like you said, we don't have the normal ways of the rituals we do have, funerals or bringing meals or all of those things. So it's kind of like it stripped everything down to its bare bones, revealing how raw and difficult and sometimes helpless we feel with those confusing feelings, and not knowing which ones should I be having and, which ones shouldn't I? Yeah.
So grief is when we have feelings about something that's unresolved or that's still kind of in some way going on, whether
Mhm.
a bereavement, but we have these emotions around what's happened, and it's not just a neat, tidy little
Exactly.
done, and I'm sad, I've cried, and it's over now.
I was gonna say, I wish it was that way, right? Like if we could
We
just
all
put the
do,
right
right?
label on it or like get it in a right box. And I think that's the way our minds want to try to work, to label it instead of being in there with kind of the tangled
Mhm.
mess. Yeah.
To label it and then also to tuck it away. And I think that's
Right.
a little bit to the cultural mindset you spoke to, that we kind of usually keep ourselves so busy. You know,
Hmm.
our value, what we value as a collective culture is often productivity, what we
Hmm.
produce, what we succeed at, what our work is. And so
Yeah.
we're going, and we're not really slowing down in a normal situation to
Hmm.
our feelings. The pandemic
Yeah.
forced us to do that.
Another cultural value that this has bumped up against is, like generally as a culture, we learn how to acquire things, right? Like it's kind of American kind of consumerism, just, and it's the convenience and privilege we have of most people, I would say, in our nation, even like your phone breaks. Well, you can get that replaced pretty quickly now, right?
Mm,
And so we learn a lot about how to accumulate and fix and replace things, but we don't
mm,
learn as a culture what to do with letting go or releasing things or
interesting.
when we lose things, right?
Much less when we
So,
lose people or when we lose rituals or rites of passage,
right,
a graduation ceremony, which on the surface, it's like, what? It's just a graduation. Like it could be so much more.
right,
But then if you actually
yes,
feel really sad, but confused about why you feel, that's just a complicated little bundle of emotion. And
right,
society and often our families and our culture haven't given us a way to process that. I love how you said that we don't have a funeral for, or an understood social ritual for
right.
the losses that we have gone
Yeah.
through in this life.
Yeah. So I've talked with parents who became first time parents during this time. Whoa, what a different experience of not being able to have some of the rituals of support that we have for first time parents or just people getting to meet the new family member, right? It's like sometimes
Yeah.
we don't realize grief can come with joyous things. And that's because it's like what was familiar, like we expected to be able to have this celebration, but we're not getting to.
Yeah.
And we can adapt and we can use what's there, but it's not what was familiar. It's not what I imagined or the picture that I had of, people coming together. And so that's why it gets really complicated because we don't understand, why am I having these feelings when it's supposed to be a happy time? It's still a happy time, but there's grief with it then too.
And I think that speaks to, before we started recording, you were talking a little bit around how grief is so much more than just the sadness and the
Yeah.
loss. You know, grief can just be this umbrella for, or not, maybe not umbrella, but grief encompasses so much more than we label it in our
Yeah.
culture. Grief
Yeah.
as that conflicted feeling around not being able to celebrate the birth of your child, and then also having the stress and the fear of being around family because of contact with COVID-19 and wanting to protect your baby or wanting to protect your grandma, but then also wanting to connect with friends. And so it's just fraught and complicated.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like another phrase we sometimes use in like just under like making it more space for what grief is in grief recovery. We'd say, grief is about things we wish had been different or better,
Mm.
or more things, even just the circumstances or something, I wish I had known how to do that differently or better or someone else. But it's also about the unmet hopes, dreams, and expectations of the future. Because our minds, we paint a picture of the future. We don't have to try to do that. We just
Yes.
automatically carry that picture. And when that picture all of a sudden gets ripped away, we are at a loss with like, what is life going to look like now? And those are different feelings of grief than the tangible loss of like someone or something, that is no longer here. It's kind of feeling the loss of what's not going to happen. And we don't even name that.
And
And we sometimes describe it, it's anytime the heart reaches out for someone to find they're no longer there.
wow.
Right. It's that ache of that longing. And that part of grief will probably always be there, right? The goal isn't for grief, like to expect that grief will go away because of that, right? It's like there's some truth to saying like, well, I'll always be sad that they're gone. Well, that's true. But some of like what starts to compound the grief, like we were talking about before, those unresolved feelings about the loss or, the painful way it happened or, other things, that there's usually multiple kinds of loss within a big life change or big life loss like that. And it's when those kind of continue to get buried or unaddressed that it kind of festers the grief versus the grief becoming this maybe coming to land in a tender, and soft place, right? Where we can still think about the good memories or we can still, have that connection if we're wanting to. Where I came into calling my practice love and loss counseling. I mean, I do some work with couples and, helping them with and individuals with their love relationships, but it's really about how those things are hand in hand. Because as a culture, we don't embrace grief and loss very well. It actually robs us of some really important things about living. And when that continues to be unresolved, it constricts people from being able to love because we don't want to take the risk or we don't want to, it's like they're in the back of our mind. So yeah, it's kind of the whole topic of death, even though we know it's the one thing we are all going to experience, it's so taboo. We don't talk about it, but that keeps us from, if we're trying to push that away, the reality of death, it actually keeps us from living more fully, So I'm kind of like that weirdo. Sometimes it's like, oh, I love talking about grief, but it's not because I'm morbid. Maybe I'm a little morbid, but it's really because I see like how much freedom it brings people when they can face the thing they're most scared of, right? And find that it's not, it is scary, it is big, but it's not, but there's value and there's meaning in that when we can connect through it versus kind of avoiding it.
When we hurry past our losses, when we don't stop
Yeah.
to investigate what feels really hard, scary, and difficult, it gets bigger and it gets heavier and it weighs us down and it becomes a wedge between us and to fully be in our lives. Whereas when we reach for it, I love how you said like when grief as when the heart reaches out for someone and they're not there, like that's just makes me want to saying it. It's so true and so sorrowful but sweet.
Yeah.
When we can cultivate that kind of a relationship to our loss, then we kind of open to life in a different way.
Yeah. I want to be sure and name though, because sometimes often in grief conversations, grief circles, or even in the academia, what doesn't get named is the loss of someone who wasn't a loved one, or what we might call less than loved one, or the relationship wasn't good, that kind of death, where that's a different kind of conflicting feelings, because it's not being able to reach out there for the good memories or the sweetness that was there, but it is still grief because it's the loss of that possibility, and sometimes people get really confused. Why is this person, or, maybe a parent I wasn't close to anymore, but they died. And now I'm having all these feelings that are so confusing.
Yeah.
So I just like to always be able to name, just like we experience grief with positive events, we can experience grief with negative relationships or ones that, weren't what we hoped for, because it's a different way of reaching out and not, being able to reach them. So I think that's always really important to get out there and name that that's sometimes the complicated part of grief is when it wasn't someone we were close to, but maybe, we expected to be, or at one point wanted to be. Another big thing we've seen this last year is around political and social things that have put rifts for families or in relationships, right? Like whether it's where people felt really different about their risk and, safety measures or other things that, and where maybe people chose or just realized they needed distance for the sake of the relationship. So it's kind of like, even when we make those choices, we can still feel the grief of that loss, like wishing it were different, wishing, we could connect through all of this and seeing how big some of the barriers are to connection. So that's some ways that living grief even happens, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
wow, this is really hard. But can I feel sad about it if it's something that I chose, to take a step back from? But yes, you can, because that was a hard choice and not one you probably really wanted to make.
I mean, what we're talking about is basically just the different kinds of losses that
Mm,
I've gone through. And I mean, when you think about the whole gamut of this last year, people's losses have been very different, from
mhm,
multiple family members dying. And, as you spoke to in the beginning of this conversation, how often in our society do so many people in our community go through bereavement at the same time?
mhm.
And then, from that to the unresolved ongoing living losses, like not being able to hug my sister for a year, or
Yeah.
families have different political, social opinions about how to navigate the pandemic. And so then there's this
Mhm.
disconnect. How do we deal with these different types of grief?
Yeah.
What tools can we use here?
Yeah, I think for me, the most important thing, if we could get this, it could change all of our lives, is if we could not compare. And comparing happens in a couple different ways. Sometimes we're comparing our losses to others as a way to try and make ourselves feel better, meaning saying like somebody has it worse than I do. I need to remember that, right? Like I need to be grateful for what I have. And it's not that that's a bad thing. Like that is a good way to have perspective and compassion, but when that's used in a way to like shut down your own pain, then your pain has no place to go. Yeah. And I think if that's about as effective as trying to push a beach ball underwater, right? Like if you want to try to hold it, it actually takes a lot of energy to do that. And that's why we feel that it adds to the exhaustion and like the other things that we might not think of grief, like loss of motivation, just exhaustion, those sorts of things. Because actually all of our energy is going into just trying to like hold this stuff, and maybe hold it back because I don't want to, it's already so hard out there for so many people. Mine doesn't need to be a part of it. That's a comparison thing.
Yeah.
Another way we unintentionally, do maybe don't aren't very helpful or maybe do some harm in comparing is like when someone's telling us about something they're going through and we respond with in kind, saying like, oh yeah, well, my friend's mom died last week, and it comes from this place of we want to connect and we want to enter into that story, but it has this unintended effect. And you just hear it from people all the time. And when you're in the position, you start to feel it, yourself, but it's something we just do. We've learned to do to like try to meet someone's story with another story. But it's kind of like taking the mic because all of a sudden that person's like, oh, am I supposed to be caring about you right now? Or we're, so if we could just say like, all of our grief is unique and it all stands on its own, even when we feel like we're experiencing similar things. Because like, what we were saying earlier, if you have two people in a room that both lost a parent, their relationship to that parent was maybe very different. And so, one may have had the relationship they wanted. And so it's the sadness of missing them, but one may not have had the relationship they wanted. So their sadness is different. So like where we make assumptions or we try to compare or we try to dismiss because we're comparing our loss is not as important. No, everybody suffers from that. So I think if it's like this example I use of like, if we both slammed our finger in the door at that moment, it's not going to help me to try and say like, oh, Ariana, how your finger's probably hurting more than mine. Let's not talk about my pain. Right.
Oh my gosh, no.
Right. Because we experience our pain at 100%, whatever it is. Now, the fact is, maybe your finger's broken and mine's not, and yours needs different kind of support or help or healing. The healing process might be different, and mine might be bruised, but at that moment, the pain is what we feel. So it's about kind of trying to create that space that we're not shutting ourselves down. We're not trying to play tennis, because like I was thinking like in those conversations where we're telling each other like this story, that story, what doesn't sometimes feel good about that, like sometimes we can kind of relate, but it doesn't leave the ball any place to land. We're just kind of knocking around those feelings. So again, it's another way it reveals like, there's a lot for us to learn about how to meet each other's grief. Like One of my favorite questions to ask in a room actually is, to ask people to raise their hands if they've had any training in first aid and CPR, right? And in a given room, like so many professions with your, childcare, or, whatever it is, this has been deemed important by our society to get first aid training and to be recertified. Yeah. Yet the likelihood of any of us needing to perform CPR, thankfully, is probably rare to, never. Yeah. But yet we're not taught how to meet each other's loss and grief. And that's one thing we're all going to experience, change in life. And here we come to that ill-equipped. We don't know what to say or what to do that is going to be more helpful. So we say all these unintended, intended to be helpful things that can sometimes even be harmful and shut it down further. So it's that constriction that either comes in ourselves, like shutting it down, or we create that constriction in the conversation that just kind of shuts it down instead of making more space for it. Any phrase that starts with that least, it's just like, if we could get the taboo buzzer to say, like, let's just stop right there. It's not, it comes from this place, we're trying to make ourselves feel better, but instead just need that moment to say, like, no, that sucks. That's hard. This is so hard right now. Do you want to tell me more? What is it like to be you right now going through it? I know it's like what it's been like for me to go through it, but I don't know what it's been like for you to go through this. So like those intellectual kind of statements that maybe it is even true. It's just that it's not helpful. And that's what's tricky, right? Because it's like you're trying to offer it like as a lifeline, throwing them a rope, like, oh, if you would just grab onto like thinking about it this way, like they're no longer suffering, it'll pull you out of your pain, but it doesn't, and instead it's kind of like that lifeline smacks them in the face and kind of just makes them feel a bit worse, but we'd like that intellectual muscle as like a lifeboat, we want to climb in there if it would just carry us away, but it doesn't.
Do you think?
And like you were saying before, like we want to say, oh, I understand what you're feeling because of this, or maybe on the story, because we're trying to reach for that understanding in ourselves. But instead it would actually maybe be so much more helpful to say, I don't know what it's like to be you, but I care, right? Like we're trying to say the thing that we actually mean is like, wow, I really care about what you're going through. It matters to me, and I'm sad that I don't know how to help you, but I'm here, right? Those things it exposes our own vulnerability in that moment, which I think is why it's harder to do, because we're trying to support someone else. So we want to feel, steady ourselves. And so that's just being in there with them is such a gift. There's some cultures that have better traditions around that and rituals of like just sitting with, and if the person needs to cry, you cry. If they need to laugh, you laugh. You do with them by being with them without any expectation of it needing to go one way or another. But we haven't cultivated that as much in our relationships. We want to be more efficient, I think, sometimes, and, that we miss out on the connection. It's like, I remember being a little girl and getting into my Nana's like jewelry chest and like her necklaces that would be all in knots, I would just sit there and really, if you applied more pressure, it would just tighten it up more, it took this patience and this slowness to unravel that. And I think that's what grief really is. It's not these labels or boxes. It's this untangling and helping each other get untangled from this net that comes for us when change like that happens.
That's a really beautiful analogy. Grief is like a tangle of knots that we have to make sense to, just with gentleness and kindness and love, entangle and see what. And there might be some crying, there might be some anger, there might be some happiness, there might be some regret. But when we do the untangling, that process itself helps us to move forward without carrying the load of the, knotted up necklaces on our back as we go into life. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say like, you mentioning that reminds me that grief isn't like a formula. It's not addition and subtraction, because subtraction are the things that go away and you can't just add other things in there that will replace them. Grief, instead, it's more like alchemy. It's more like chemistry. It's like you go through something and it's going to transform. And when we can get it, when we can see that or know that or believe that or hear that that's possible, it's a hard thing to go through, to face and go through, but we can't really go around it or over it or shortcut it. It is something to go through, and it will change us. Grief
Mhm.
is messy. It's disruptive. I've loved that description that people said. You don't get to choose when sometimes it comes up or disrupts, your day. But feeling better equipped to meet those moments, to know like that doesn't mean anything's wrong with you, doesn't mean you're not doing it right, doesn't mean you're not getting over it. It's like, this is the alchemy, this is the change that's happening because
Yeah.
of the loss, right?
Yeah.
And people do, it's hard to describe. How can, when you can't imagine how life could ever be sweet again or good again or hopeful again. There aren't simple answers for that, except to kind of hold each other through it. That's why another, this kind of gets into maybe things we can do for our grief. So yeah, I think the first step is really giving ourselves permission. We've kind of said that in various ways. Maybe it just starts right here to say, like, it's okay for me to grieve. It's okay for me to not be okay for a
Mhm.
while,
Yeah.
So it's kind of that permission and space. And when I think of space, like space, giving ourselves space means giving ourselves the space of time, not
Mhm.
thinking, that this gets done in a week or 3 months or a year. Some of that
Mm.
grief is still happening because it's the first holiday without them. So that grief is a new piece of the grief, right? So
Yeah.
it's recognizing that grief has that digestion, the metabolism of that grief takes a long time. And so we need this space for that. But space also means like the spaces, like the kind of places to be able to do that. Like it doesn't happen very well just alone inside our own minds and
Mm.
bodies. So that kind of leads to a second thing, I think, is like, if we realize grief is an emotion and all the emotions that are in there. I love that it was pointed out to me sometime recently that emotions says motion. We need it to move, right?
Yes.
And what we try
So
to do is we try to kind of hold our thoughts and our feelings, but we need it to move. So especially, I know as a medical practice, you guys will understand it's in the body. It's not only in our mind and our body. So we need to help it moving. Because unresolved grief has major health effects for folks, and can exasperate what's already there, but can cause, health things that we just see when it's held in the body. So I
Mhm.
think of like, if we can just get it moving, and there's not a right or wrong way, exactly, there's not going to be one way, it's going to be different people, but one way we can get emotions moving could be through journaling, could be through like art. And I don't mean like fine art, I mean like messy, just whatever art. I think that's where using music intentionally, like
Mm.
listening to things that help, it's kind of like the music can come in and kind of help carry out some of those, feelings sometimes. Um, that's where rituals, because if we do have rituals, personal or collective in our communities, it gives us symbols or things, actions we can do for like moving through making meaning of, the different feelings and that are there. And I would say, that's where connecting, with a therapist or somebody that knows grief well. Not all therapists do, but that know how to help that move through versus just kind of cycling around and around. Because sometimes even when we think about it, or even if we talk about it, it can feel like we're just kind of unpacking it and then repacking it back in. So we've got to
Yes.
find the ways that actually help this move through, move along, and
Mm.
which is the active process. And I think then things even in the body, if that's a place to start, like gentle movement or opening, because so much of grief is constricting. So I think of just how powerful it can sometimes be for people just to, if you lay down and actually open your chest and your body and just lay there with some music moving, giving yourself that permission to feel whatever you feel in that moment. And it might be different from day to day. But those are some of my thoughts about moving it. And then I think is the other part we've said, so giving it permission, helping it move, and then connection. We are human beings, so we didn't get shaped in a vacuum. So I don't think much of our healing can happen in a vacuum without
Mhm.
connection. But that, like we've been saying, that gets tricky because when people don't know what to say, a lot of times people have had the experience, well, I tried to talk about my grief, then this happened, that didn't feel good. So I'm not going to do that again. or people don't want to hear this, or, or they've heard it too long, they're getting tired of it.
Yeah.
So it's about finding the connection that is going to help, so I think of it like, I own a car. Most of my friends own cars, and though their cars have problems, but it doesn't mean I go to my friends to get help with my car. I might, if I have a friend that I know, like, oh, they've fixed their car, maybe they can give me some tips on what maybe I can do for this problem. But eventually I'm probably going to go to a mechanic, And so, of course, that, I can't help but put a plug in here for counseling that, sometimes people feel like going to counseling means they are not doing their grief right. Like it's when it's gotten so bad or they need help with it. But I would say, actually, it might be the best place to start, because that person is going to be equipped and going to be there for doing the listening, and not, hopefully they, are practiced in how to listen and create that space and help it move, So there's no shame in that. In fact, it might be one of the wisest things. And I often see, what I've gotten to see is brave people. They wouldn't call themselves brave, but when people are really willing to turn into and look at their grief and move through it, it's such an honor to see how that brings freedom in their life, whether it's more peace or more joy, physical health returning. So it's not about like being broken and then you need to go to the therapist. It's like, no, I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to say, this change has happened. Like, this has shattered my world, or this is this chronic stuff that I don't know. I'm just have accumulated the weight of all of this stuff from this last year. But to find the spaces and the places to help connect, feel supported, and to move, help the feelings start to get untangled. The last thing I would mention about like what to do to get started is keep an eye open for, watch out for shortcuts. The shortcuts are really tempting, and our society feeds them to us all the time. But shortcuts are like those things that it will help me feel better for a while, or for a little while, or at least help me feel different. And some of those shortcuts can compound the problems, like substances, but they sure are effective, like shortcut, right? For the moment, I can forget about it, or I can feel relaxed, but the grief is still going to be there. And even really like shortcuts that look good, like giving ourselves to work or volunteering or taking care of others, those can be good things to help keep our, get one foot in front of the other. But they're short-term helps. They're not going to be long-term helps. And sometimes that's another confusing thing for people. They think, well, I've been going to the gym. I'm doing all the things I need to be doing. Why do I still feel this way? So to know that that's normal as well. Those things are good things to be doing to kind of help stabilize and, support you going through that. But it's not going to actually take care of the grief itself. That's different. It's different work. And I will add with that, because we often do say, just give it time, which is true. And that's one of those tricky ones where it's true and, right? Like, if it just took time, then we wouldn't see people who struggled and suffered from grief for decades, right? So it takes time and some intentionality and some of these things that we haven't been taught or learned or given opportunity and support to do. So I think that's a really important thing, because sometimes we can think, we've heard like, oh, I just need to go through the stages of grief, or I just need to give it time. And some of that's misunderstood and misinformation, or it's only half of the helpful information that then can be a setup for people wondering, well, I've been giving it time. Again, what's wrong with me? And so I just really would want to say to people, it's not anything that's wrong with you. We don't have a lot of accurate and helpful information just floating around in our culture on how to deal with grief. So instead of thinking something's wrong with you, trust that it's probably something very right with you that's saying, you know what, this is hard and this mattered. And I'm not just going to try and get over that right away because this was important, So we need to give it time and support and some skills, and some process. I often see myself like in the grief work that I do is, as a grief counselor, I'm not trying to fix people. And it's really more like, I feel like I just get to be the one shining the light on the path. Like this is a natural human thing, but we've actually learned so many things that are not natural and helpful in our way of moving through it. So, I see it's a way of helping people feel the permission, get the space, feel supported while they move through that untangling, of the grief, whether it's a safe place to go with the anger that maybe wouldn't be something they could express to the rest of the family, or, to go through everything that might be a part of that. Well, I think, and that you were kind of saying this too, that, not all therapists are the same. And sometimes people don't know, like, it's okay to find a good fit. And it's hard because that's when you don't have the energy and you're probably at your lowest point. Some of the things I've been touched by the most is actually when a friend is calling on behalf of another friend to find out about grief support. I think, wow, this person has someone in their life that, what a way to be a friend when you don't know what to say or what to do. Calling around to find therapists that specialize in grief and have availability and work with their insurance, like all those logistical things. That's such a great way for a friend to be a friend through grief. And then they hand off that information. Of course, the person gets to make their own choices from there. But all that legwork that takes so much energy, that's hard to do when you're in the midst of grief. So, but taking the time to find, because not all therapists are the same. There's not even, like I said, in the first half of my career, I had misunderstandings about grief and limited and misinformation. And so finding someone that is really working in that, it matters. The same thing for groups. I think there's a lot of great, community support groups that offer safe space just to land and be, and that works for some people. But sometimes those groups aren't really structured enough, or it can unintentionally become the comparison thing. And so people have had really mixed experiences sometimes with that being a positive. So to know that there are other types of groups, not just open support groups, but like grief recovery is a more structured group where everybody's doing their own work through this process. They're getting the understanding. They're also getting these skills and tools and the experience of the process of being able to go through that. I also love the group, even though most times people are intimidated by that. It's because they get the practice of the social piece that we miss, right? They get the practice of learning how to listen and be okay, like, oh, I don't have to say anything to fix this right now. You just have to be here and be willing to be present and trust that that's enough. So, and that can be found, those types of groups can be found, a lot of different places, but they are different. So if something's not working for you, I would encourage you, don't automatically assume it's something that's wrong with you. It might not be the right resource yet. And when we can say that it's not because I see that something's wrong with you, it's because I care about you and you deserve this. You deserve support. You deserve help. It's not because, you're failing or you're breaking down or something. It's like, no, this is, what you deserved, support and help going through this difficult time.
That sounds like a really important reframe for all of us.
I think of it as like a loving parent with their child that's going through a difficult time, even having a tantrum or, is just overstimulated. They're just they're at their limit. They're, and a loving parent's going to come to that child with that understanding, not with judgment, not with like making them feel worse, not with saying like, get over it. It's going to, loving parents going to come around and be like, oh, buddy, you're having a hard time right now. I'm here. You're not alone, right? We're going to just do those comforting, present things. And sometimes we think as adults, maybe we forget that we still need that very same thing to hear, like, oh, you're having a hard time right now. That's okay. You're not alone. I'm here.
That's beautiful. Anything else that you want to add as we wrap up our conversation today?
I have a few resources that might be helpful. Okay. And if that's helpful, I can share and you can incorporate those, whatever. So I've mentioned in my certification is in the Grief Recovery Handbook. And so the Grief Recovery Handbook, I would say even like that question again of where to start when it feels overwhelming is if people could read the first 5 chapters of this book, which is only that much, it is life-changing. I mean, I know that's a very strong statement to say, but a lot of the things we're talking about today about where we actually get caught and constricted in our grief, the first 5 chapters of this book can like just open that up and create that space and that safety to have those feelings. And even if you're just someone who cares about someone that's going through a hard time, reading those 5 chapters can help you feel more equipped to not make some of those missteps, of saying the things that are actually less than helpful. It also, this kind of makes some of the connection to health and habits that we have from grief And then it's actually about a process. So it's not just talking about grief, it's about action as well. So that's a lot of the work that I do with individuals and with groups. And like the Grief Recovery Institute has a directory, so people can find connection with that all over the nation, especially now that it's available. You don't have to be in person for it. So there's, certified grief recovery specialists, some that are therapists as well, but some are not. So I would say when people have more complicated loss, I think find someone who's also a therapist, because they bring all of those skills as well. But also from the Grief Recovery Institute is When Children Grieve. And this is for any adults helping children basically through change, which could be death, but it has an amazing chapter on divorce. Pet loss is usually the first encounter that children have with getting their messages about grief, and adults can feel really overwhelmed with not knowing how to help them with that. So that's another really great resource for people. Two others that I would like to share.
Great. I can't wait to read these.
The Compassion Code. This is written by someone who is strongly affiliated with the Grief Recovery Institute, but Laura Jack wrote a book just on how to say the right thing when the wrong thing happens. And so this book on its own is just full of ways of like rewiring our way of relating to each other, and in all those ways that can be more helpful and less harmful. So that's really helpful one, because sometimes when people start with the grief recovery book, they read those chapters, they're like, okay, now I know all the things I shouldn't be saying, and then what do I say and do? Okay. So that can kind of help us build that out. And then the last book I wanted to share, and again, these aren't just books, but you could probably find articles, snippets, videos as well. But the Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller. So the subtitle of this says Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief. So what I love about this resource is, again, it broadens the lens. It says grief isn't only about death, but death certainly is a human experience that we're going to encounter. But he kind of talks about there's like these different gates of grief, like different realms of grief, and some of them are personal, and then some of them are the collective. And so for me, it was the first time that some of that got named, like this collective grief and the impact of that, and seeing grief as this thing that it's happening, it's already impacting us, but how to work with it in a way that it can change us, not tear us down, but can become something else. So this
where
book,
we bend, don't break.
Right. Yeah. And so I like these for different reasons. Grief Recovery, I like, it's very straightforward. It's very simple, easy reading that kind of is more like, it's almost like, whoa, common sense, but it's common sense we need, again, because we've lost it. Frances Weller's book I like because he's more of almost like a poet in his writing. It's very, it's very beautiful and kind of gets into more kind of philosophical. Sometimes I can only read a little bit and digest it, but that's also because it's just kind of like, oh my goodness, like that makes such difference to look at it that way, or to realize that gives honor to grief, gives dignity to grief. And that's something I think we could really, really use versus feeling ashamed or at a loss about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, that just feels so true as well. That I think that the sense of shame or discomfort about reaching out to a therapist is that there's something about being stuck in grief, where it's like you should have already been able to deal with it.
Yeah.
And there isn't a lot of dignity ascribed in our culture to the process of grieving at all.
Yeah. Like if I was stronger, I'd be over this. If I was smarter, if I was more of this, versus like, oh, what if I'm just very human? It's a good thing to be human and to feel these things. It makes us more human to one another.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for sharing all those resources, Tamara. Those are amazing.
Oh, I forgot. There is one more that I love.
Sure.
It's called Tear Soup. And it's written like a storybook, like a child's storybook, but it's so wonderful for adults as well. And you can even find it like in like a YouTube, like there's some folks that they've put the pictures and read the story on YouTube. But the book is really great because it has a few pages of resources in the back, like little bullet points of like if it's a child going through grief, or if it's man going through grief, because unfortunately our culture's also shaped us with different permissions in gendered ways sometimes too, of what feelings we can have. So it's just a beautiful, sweet story about, like, again, creating some more understanding about grief being normal and natural and doesn't have to be scary. It's a story of like a grandmother having this ongoing conversation with like a grandchild, and you don't even know exactly what the loss is, and because it doesn't matter as much as they're just talking about what it's like to be going through these conflicting feelings over time and needing support. The Institute's website, they have a great blog, free articles that you can look up by topic, because they're all different types of loss. We actually say there's 40 different life events that can produce feelings of loss.
Wow.
40. So not just maybe the 5 that we might even be able to name off the top of our minds, but so there's a lot.
Maybe that's part of why the pandemic has hit so many folks with grief that is not being labeled as by us, because it's just confusing and it doesn't fit into the boxes that we expect grief to look like.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, the beautiful thoughts you've shared, and the fantastic
strategies.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love talking about it because I think it can change people's lives.